Magandang umaga. If I said it right, that means good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this first keynote session this morning. My name is John Mason. I'm an academic at Charles Darwin University in the north of Australia, and so I'll be chairing this session for this next hour. And I will introduce you to the keynote speaker. Before I do, just a couple of words. I was here on Sunday. I had the good fortune to come to this theatre on Sunday for a performance from the Manila Ballet, a performance of an epic poem that talked about the history of conflict and romance in history in the Philippines is coming up to the current day, and it was a really high energy performance on this stage. It went for nearly 2 hours, and it was a little bit cold actually in this theatre for 2 hours, but I really enjoyed the high energy of that on Sunday evening. And then this morning we have a follow-up cultural performance. It was really nice to have that cultural element here, this dimension in the sessions that we have at ICCE events. One of the reasons we come and enjoy face-to-face events is so we can meet each other, see each other, and perhaps participate a little bit in culture. So that brings me to the introduction part, and I've got to tell you, I've known about Dragan Gasevic. I've been practicing that. I have known about Dragan. My friends actually in Australia call him Dragon, but I've known of him and his work for at least a decade, and I've really wanted to meet him. And so all of a sudden I get a chance to meet him, but the ICCE Executive Committee organising the conference said, John, can you introduce Dragan? So here I am. This is my chance to meet you, Dragan. So look, without any further babbling on from me, I would like to introduce Dragan. He's a professor in the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University, Monash in Australia, where actually I did my undergraduate degree. And he's been there for several years. He's well known for his work, particularly in learning analytics. He heads a centre there for the Centre of Learning Analytics at Monash. That's COLAM, I think it's called. And he is here to talk to us today about getting ready for the age of AI, as if we weren't already trying to get ready for it, but getting ready for the world of AI in terms of self-regulated learning. So without any further ado, please can everybody give Dragan a nice big welcome to ICCE.
So John, thanks so much for the kind introduction. Also, colleagues, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here at ICCE for the first time. So really thanks so much, Didit, as well, for all the arrangements and the hospitality that you already showed to me. I'm really very happy to speak to you about artificial intelligence and education. I'll be mostly speaking about human learning because my passion really lies with learning, because learning happens over time, education happens formally, just a limited period of time in our lives. So many of you are probably familiar with what's happened in the last 2 years, that many things that many of us were trying to do and show to the rest of the world that the AI should be there, part of the not only education but the life, actually start getting lots of traction. Many people still thought, well, we can actually duck also this same problem, that we can actually ignore yet another hype because things will actually go away. But AI is not going to go away. Whether we like the current instantiation of AI or not, I can talk much more about that, but The reality is that we cannot automatically detect that. We cannot really try to force the students not to use some of these AI. Earlier this morning, I got them to speak to one of the radios in Australia, and they asked me, the University of Sydney is announcing they are allowing their students to use AI, as if they could actually let them and allow them to use AI. They're already using it. So in a way, that's the acknowledgement of the reality. But when we are basically looking a little bit at some of the other implications, I don't know what's going on with my... Oh, okay. But when we are talking about AI and the use of AI in education, we really need to think about what are the potential implications of that. There have been several studies recently that showed that some of the studies are indicating, a recent study in Science published that predicts that about 50% of the jobs will have at least 20% of their individual tasks exposed to generative AI. In other words, doesn't mean they will be fully automated, but they may actually require the use of generative AI. Some other studies, like the one that was done here in the Philippines by MIT and Stanford, show that in certain areas, such as problem solving through service provisioning, can increase in novice workers 35% productivity. Another study in Australian banking sector showed that in software engineering productivity can be increased as much as 40+%. And yet, current modern generative AI is imperfect, lies, fabricates facts, doesn't really have the connection with the reality. So in a recent paper, we argued that we really need to develop adaptive learners. Learners who can adapt to the situation of the changing workplaces. And the reality is that with the development of the AI, likelihood of the changing of the nature of work, of the knowledge work, is likely to be much higher than we've seen so far in the past. Even just some of our generation now are seeing much higher velocity of the change of work, and therefore the needs for skilling, upskilling, and the development of the skills much greater than it was in the past. So then the key question is, how do we develop these adaptive learners? My argument for you today is that we need to really make sure that they have sufficient strong abilities to learn independently. Abilities to learn independently are really underpinned fully with self-regulated learning. The question, though, is what is new in this new space that is not so known to us with respect to the self-regulated learning, and why I'm going to use 45 minutes of your time today to talk to you about the things that many people spoke about for the last 40+ years. I want to introduce this thinking model that we came up with a few months ago, in which we want to basically discuss a little bit how we are thinking about the changes of the human skills and knowledge with the introduction of AI. And I generally distinguish here two key dimensions. One dimension is the AI as a support tool or as an assistant. That's our ChatGPT, vanilla ChatGPT, that is primarily tending to improve the performance on different types of tasks for as long as we have some skills to use that tool, and also as long as that tool is suitable for the task. But that doesn't apply that we have the abilities ourselves to do some of these specific tasks. We still need to develop human skills as well. And the development of these human skills is going in a good old scaffolding way. The way that we are actually trying to build up human capacities. Then the ultimate potentially goal is how we can develop human high skills while at the same time benefiting from the AI. So the idea is then how we can have that additive effect of the two cognitive systems, if you wish. But the challenge really that is profound for most of us is that if people want to develop some of these skills, especially independently, but even for us in education, formal education systems, we need to account what people can do independently. And in most of cases, literature shows that learners have relatively limited abilities to effectively self-regulate their learning. Although we self-regulate our learning all the time, self-regulated learning is not a pedagogy, it's the way how we learn. That's as simple as that. So then I'm going to spend most of my talk today discussing how we develop human self-regulated learners for the age of AI. And some of you heard me speaking before, so you know that I like to give immediately my conclusions as well. So number one conclusion is that there is no free lunch for adaptive learners, meaning that just because we can mimic some of our skills in certain situations with the use of generative AI, it does not mean that we have the abilities. Only this additive effect of the high human skills and the empowerment through the use of AI happens when we have high levels of human skills. I'll show some evidence and the reasons why I make this claim. Number two, generative AI has a tendency to make us lazy learners. That is to say, to promote what I call lazy metacognition. And we just had a paper as well in BJET accepted that unpacks this concept of lazy metacognition. It is happening when we are using generative AI in a fairly unscaffolded way, in a way that is actually removing some of our attention and disabling some of our critical thinking as we are going forward. Number three is that while there's some emerging evidence in this space about the use of generative AI in learning, we are seeing so far mostly cross-sectional studies. We need far more longitudinal evidence to help us to understand long-term implications of the generative AI on our learning, both in terms of the scaffolding of the actual abilities that we want to develop in humans, as well as how they are interacting with some of these AI tools. All right, so you heard my conclusion. So if you need to do something else and go, you may go. But I'll continue to speak for those who want to stay in the room. So how do we currently prepare self-regulated learning is really the major question I want to ask you. I want to briefly outline some of the key foundations that we have in this space. Some of you may be familiar with the model of Winnie and Hadwin of self-regulated learning. It's a fairly sophisticated model with lots of details. It is over 25-year-old, almost 30 years old. I'm not going to go into any of its details. You may explore it on your own self-regulated learning pace. But what I want to emphasize is the two fundamental core processes that are actually governing most of the things that are happening in self-regulated learning. That's metacognition. Metacognition is basically our abilities to think about our own thinking. Our abilities to choose or to control, that's the control process, what type of learning strategies and tactics we want to deploy in different types of learning situations. And number two is our ability to monitor how effectively the use of these specific learning tactics that we are using is effective for us. Are we progressing fast enough as we indicated we want to progress? Are we able to do at the time that we actually plan to spend to study something, to do that specific thing that we intended to do? So I'm going to just quickly go through these two key processes of self-regulated learning, that is to say metacognition, and just discuss a little bit what is the current evidence. So number one, with respect to that control of metacognitive processes, is that we basically are all learners as agents who construct our knowledge through the use of different types of learning strategies. Literature in that space, like John Landlowski, Robert Bjork, and others, documented lots of different learning strategies, and there's really lots of solid evidence that tells us which of these learning strategies are potentially effective. Some of them, like spacing effect or distributed practice, is shown to be effective from the evidence from across almost 150 years in almost every single discipline, from arts to maths to surgery and other disciplines. There are some of them that have actually very strong effect sizes on learning outcomes and others that are having relatively moderate, or they are just really good precursor for some other strategies. Like, for example, highlighting is not necessarily on its own particularly effective learning strategy, but when combined with some of these other, like self-elaboration, we are actually getting much stronger effects. But what we know, though, is that learners have a very limited repertoire of the effective learning strategies that it can deploy in different learning situations. And this was done with learners in some of the top US universities and across the world as well. So it's not that it's my school or my country or my university. It's actually epidemic. It's everywhere that is happening. Number two, the key process is how effective we are at self-evaluating how good we do something. How good is the piece of essay that we wrote? How good we can recall certain information that we are trying to work on. That's what we are using our metacognitive monitoring. And that's where we are trying to deploy our judgments before we make decisions. Because if you are not good at making the judgment of how well you know something, you may stop learning before you actually know something well. So that's why we need to do something there. But what we know from the literature is that we are highly inaccurate at judging our own learning. We are usually highly overconfident, meaning that we judge that we know much better when we actually know much less in many different types of situations. It's not as linear. Higher achieving students are actually quite underestimating how much they know certain situations. But majority is actually the other way around. But there are two other critical phenomena that are not commonly discussed in self-regulated learning literature that are highly relevant for the age of AI. Number one is basically this processing fluency. Processing fluency is something that many people might be familiar from different areas. Those who are in human-computer interaction, processing fluency is good because you want to make your user interfaces very seamless, easy to use. You don't want to even feel them, right? In the text as well, when we are reading, when we have that kind of high level of processing fluency means that text is so easy to read. But the problem is that we have the tendency to describe truthfulness to something that is easy to read, that is nicely packaged, just like ChatGPT produced nicely packaged pieces of information that are not necessarily true. And then there is the other important thing with respect to the processing fluency. When something is easy to process, we also have a tendency to go onto autopilot, meaning that we do not turn onto our critical thinking system that is judging that information that we are trying to do. Looks good, therefore doesn't have to be also thought through as we are using that information. Final thing, although not directly at the core of this self-regulated model of Winnie and Hadwin, it is basically information problem solving. I'm emphasizing that one because generative AI is potentially contaminating our existing information architectures that we need to reconsider as part of the process. So metacognition also sits at the core of information problem solving. From the perspective of the time when we start to formulate the information problem that we are trying to solve, to the time that we are trying to scan and find the information that we are trying to use, to the moment that we want to incorporate integrated information and present it to some other people. Again, we as learners use highly unreliable search strategies and different information problem-solving strategies. Just as an anecdote, about a decade ago, I got some allergic attack when I was still in Canada. My wife, being a doctor, took me to the hospital emergency, and I was already good when we arrived there, but anyways, they put me to wait for hours there, and I was observing. And I was basically looking, what do physicians do as well? And they had this big screen, and every 5 minutes, emergency physicians would come to search for some information. And can you imagine which major source for them for information was? It was Wikipedia, which is very consistent with the prior literature as well, which was done at the University of Melbourne, where they were looking at the medical students who were also using unreliable sources of information. Therefore, do you think they will not be using also potential or attempting to use generative AI in certain situations? And then there is this other sense-making paradox thing that is compounding some of these problems, is that we often ask learners to write pieces or do projects on the topics they don't have prior knowledge on. So then they basically had to make all the decisions about finding the right type of information and incorporating that information while they don't have any prior knowledge about it, which basically poses a major threat. So I want to highlight here two major risks with the introduction of the generative AI and the model that I initially presented. So literature on adaptive learning systems and intelligent Turing systems is very profound. Some people in this room are at the forefront of that space as well, and they've done absolutely amazing work in that space. But my good colleague and friend Inge Molinar argues that while we are really great in many of these adaptive systems to help learners to get right amount of information unloaded when they are completing certain learning type of tasks, we do not think sufficiently when we are designing some of these systems to help the learners to also improve their self-regulatory abilities, to address some of these challenges that I was also trying to do. So in other words, they help the students to do the task and learn some of these things, but they do not sufficiently unload metacognition as well for the learners to do some of the critical things. There's this other element that is called in the literature on cognitive psychology, cognitive offloading. The ability for us, or opportunities for us, to offload certain cognitive tasks onto the certain types of tools that we want to do. The problem is that we start offloading some of these type of things, we develop a habit we cannot easily break later. And that offloading then basically eventually starts to lead potentially into the atrophy of some of our abilities as well. The challenge, though, is that while everybody these days in education is saying, well, with the generative AI, we need to have lots of critical thinking and abilities to metacognitively judge information that we are doing, we are actually going to see much more trend, potentially, on the metacognitive offloading as well. In other words, people are not going to critically engage with that information at all. And that's a big potential risk that we need to tackle, and I'm going to discuss much more about that second risk. And what is that ultimate risk? Is all these, what I'm saying, is making us, in the age of generative AI, lazy learners that are actually not willing to engage into metacognition effectively. I think willingness here is really less of a factor because this is innate factor that is actually playing our cognitive architectures that is not then helping us to engage in some of these processes. So I'm going to present some evidence now, what do we know about the use of generative AI and some of these potential risks as well that I just outlined with respect to some of the key issues. So first, as John introduced me, I've been studying learning analytics forever. Even when we didn't call it learning analytics, it was just a nice packaged name when somebody came up. George Siemens was the first one who told me that name. We never know who named it. But anyways, so the key point is I'm making here is that we are trying to use digital data to understand self-regulated learning in the age of AI. And we are basically trying to go through different stages and processes as part of our research in that space. But when we are doing some of these things in learning analytics, we also develop lots of different tools. For us, we develop Flora. And Flora is the learning environment, which allows us to collect much more granular data about students' learning processes related to self-regulated learning, cognition and metacognition. It is collecting clicks, mouse movements, keystrokes. It can also be plugged in if you are having the lab setting as well with the eye tracking data. We also use even EEG data with Flora. But then on top of that, Flora is also having these, we call them instrumentation tools, which have also useful pedagogical value. And these tools are specifically allowing us to understand the intent of the learners so that we can have much better understanding of the digital data that students were doing. That is done through highlighting different types of tagging. So for example, students can tag that certain information is confusing, important, requires further attention, and so on. But underneath, we spent for more than 5 years understanding how we can map these low levels of data, like clicks, mouse movements, and so on, onto the high levels of SRL processes. Cognitive, metacognitive, we even looked into the other types of processes. And for that, what we are typically doing is we develop lots of mapping rules that we then eventually validated through think aloud protocols and other types of instruments to give us a bit more reassurance that the claims that we are making, that students are engaging into the SRL processes like planning or task understanding or elaboration of information, indeed it is what is happening. So the other framework that I'm going to be using, and I already mentioned, is the framework that Inge Molinar proposed, and that's called hybrid human and AI regulation. And in Inge's work, she basically posits that there are 4 types of regulation that we need to consider. Number 1 is basically that we want to see the learners, or that we may see the learners in certain situations where AI is actually taking over. Because learners have really low levels of knowledge and the metacognitive abilities, and then AI is pretty much doing most of the regulation on their behalf. Over time, we want to actually soften the use of AI so that the AI is doing less of that regulation and moves into the spaces of co-regulation, which means that AI is in certain situations taking over, to the shared regulation where AI is just making suggestions, to the final stage where we want to reach is the self-regulation where AI is just observing what learners are doing. And then once the learners finish the task, they may actually provide some reports and information so that we can promote reflection. So then I started from this potential number 1 risk that I was talking about in the development of the human skills, that we can actually see that our existing adaptive learning technologies are primarily focused on the development of the cognitive skills, which is good. And they are really good at making these dosage regimes for the learners in the right type of information to dose them to the right type of time. And so then that's basically called cognitive offloading. But what we want to also see is more process of the cognitive onloading as well. The question is that is really poorly understood is this other side. How we can actually do the cognitive onloading or offloading on this other side as well. And in what situations that is meaningful and in what situations that is not meaningful. I want to go back now to the 2 key processes that I was talking about initially. Metacognitive control is the first one, and the choices of the learning strategies that students may take. So then we did some studies in which we looked the extent to which we can use AI type of systems that can transform the learning analytic insight into the scaffolds that are adapted to the learner executed processes of self-regulated learning and prompt them to do certain types of information. We did some of that work inside of the Flora system as well, and you can see this is the scaffolding tool that is adapting to the learners what they may actually consider next, based on our understanding how highly performing and good self-regulated learners were doing their tasks in the past. What we found is that this approach, personalizing the suggestion, for example, try to go and read some information, or we are actually realize that you're already 10 minutes into this task, but you really did not even read the information about that task. So it's not a bad idea to understand the task you are trying to work on before you are actually doing something there. What we found is that there is a positive, moderate association between this type of AI-powered scaffolding and the choices of the learning strategies that students are doing. In other words, I'm using really very careful language here to say that learners have a much higher tendency to adopt much better learning strategies when we would be prompting them in this direction. So this is a positive thing because we can see that this type of scaffolding can actually move some of our metacognitive abilities into this higher level corner where I wanted to see us to be going. Then what is the next direction is basically that we want to see is the extent to which we can integrate these scaffolds with the also use of some of the AI support tools. So in other words, what we are trying to do in Flora is we basically are using these learning analytics insights to prompt generative AI large language models so that they can prompt the learners in a certain direction, but then the learners can continue chatting with this type of technology and also start using generative AI as well for helping them to enhance in certain situations. But bear in mind that we can observe everything what is going on in these type of situations. Our hope and hypothesis is that we can actually get in this way learners, once they develop higher levels of their own abilities, to gradually also start to benefit from the use of generative AI. We just had one new paper accepted last week that is offering us promising step in this direction. But if you're looking for promising research topics as well, want to do, this is really the space to look into, because there is so little understanding of what is going on in this space and how to move the needle from high human skills to this additive effect of the high human skills with the AI support tools. The number two is, what is the effect of generative AI on monitoring, metacognitive monitoring, how generative AI is helping us to be good judges of our own learning? Well, my hypothesis was always it will make us terrible, right? Because of all this literature, because of this continuous tendency to offload metacognitively whatever we are doing. And there is emerging evidence. There was a study published earlier this year at CHI, the top HCI conference, in which they were looking at the abilities of the learners to seek information from either ChatGPT or one of these very popular question and answering forums on which humans been generating answers. In their case, they were using Stack Overflow systems. What I found is that although that ChatGPT had more than 50% of the cases inaccurate information in it, learners still prefer to use it over human-generated. When they ask them why, because it reads well. It's much more articulate. Humans are not perfect. They are not generating perfectly crafted sentences that ChatGPT is doing. And that's basically going back to the problem I was talking about, processing fluency and illusion of truth effect, meaning that we love to get beautifully packaged information even if it's completely bogus. And that's a problem that we need to tackle in education. So this is really what is happening, is that we basically, when this type of generative AI tool is applied as a support tool on a task where it's not good fit for, we are basically seeing that learners are immediately going into this metacognitive and cognitive offloading, and they revert back to very poor, low skills. There's even more evidence about this that I'm going to present. But obviously, generative AI can be useful as well to create it into a good scaffold. So in Flora, we also have these tools that are helping us to support learners to write. And when they are writing, we can actually provide these different types of writing analytics for them that are basically highlighting, for example, whether they are using good grammar or not, or whether they are integrating information that they are supposed to be integrating as part of the process. So we wanted to see the extent to which this type of analytics that is powered with the generative AI underneath can actually help us to improve students' judgment of learning. So we did a study in which we asked learners for 2 hours to read some curated set of documents, and in that set of documents, then we wanted them to produce an essay. After 2 hours, we gave them 1 hour break, and then we asked them to go into 4 different conditions. They were randomized into those 4 conditions. One basically used this writing analytics that I just showed. One group had access to ChatGPT. One had access to the human tutor through the chat system, and one had nothing of these 3 tools. So we basically will now just focus on these 2 primary conditions. Learners using these tools that are supporting their writing abilities with the writing analytics, and no tool at all. What we found is that basically learners self-assessment so rapidly skyrocketed when we introduced these type of tools. So typically, as I said, learners are overconfident, highly inaccurate. When they did not have this tool to use, their correlation between their prediction of how well their essay was versus what actual score was negative 0.5 correlation, right? When they used this particular tool, that completely flipped, became positive 0.5 correlation. So in other words, we were able, with the good scaffolding tools, to increase students' own abilities to better judge what they are doing. So this basically tells us that human-AI shared regulation has the potential as well to lead us to certain better human skills. The challenge, though, is that what we observed is that AI may not have, even though it's promoting some things, it may also have some side effects. And what I'm going to say now, most of you who are teachers will actually sympathize as well. Learners always blame the AI for whatever they missed, although they benefited from AI, like they would blame their teachers as well, at least in Australia, when they don't know something, right? So it's as if the teacher's fault is that. So then the question is, even if we are introducing some of these tools, is how we are gradually removing this type of a scaffold, which is really a old question that we need to tackle in the cognitive and educational psychology. And then, therefore, we really need to understand as well long-term effects of these types of scaffolds. You see that they are offering some promise, but what is the long-term implication? We don't understand. In another study I'm going to mention now is we actually had a bit of a more longitudinal design, but we were actually primarily focusing on the AI support tool, not the scaffold tool. Support tool is just aiming to enhance performance, like doping for sports people, or just like wearing an exoskeleton. So this was a study done with the colleagues at the University of Queensland, in which we basically wanted to focus on the problem of peer feedback. They developed this system called Ripple, in which they wanted to crowdsource questions for students so that they can use them for practice. But over time, they realized that the quality of these questions was not best, therefore they introduced peer feedback. But then they again realized, well, students are not the greatest at providing feedback as well. And so the idea was then to introduce some of the AI tools that are based on some of these similar language technologies. In this specific case was based on BERT, in which learners got the assistance or support how they can reformulate and change their feedback. So in other words, the tool was not crafted as a scaffold, it was mostly crafted to just improve the performance on this specific task. So then we had this randomized control trial in which we asked learners for 4 weeks to use this peer feedback system with the AI support tool. There was about 1,600 students in the trial. After 4 weeks, they were randomized into 4 conditions. One group continued using this AI support tool. One group did not have any extra support. One group got a new scaffolding support, which was basically a simple rubric as a checklist for them to actually turn their cognitive abilities and use them to judge whether they are actually providing good feedback or not. And one group basically had a combination of both this scaffold tool as well as the AI support tool. What happened is basically, while the learners who were in the AI condition outperformed the quality of their feedback, all other groups, the benefits completely disappeared when the AI support was removed. In other words, nothing was converted into the actual human skills. And this is basically also the evidence that was shown in a recent study as well, led by the University of Pennsylvania, when they asked students to use vanilla or base ChatGPT for several years versus learners who were using ChatGPT, but which was prompted to actually act as a tutor. So the learners, when they were removed from these tutor or ChatGPT base, the learners who were using the base or vanilla ChatGPT, they were 15 or 16% worse on their performance in the maths than students who did not have any of these type of tools. So that basically tells us that generative AI in these type of situations can be even not only not beneficial, but harmful in many situations. And this is really my key challenge. And this is what I'm calling is why we have this metacognitive laziness that can lead to potentially atrophy of our cognitive and metacognitive abilities, which is a really major challenge we need to think about. What we also observed in this specific study is that benefits were present when the AI support tool was replaced with a scaffolding tool, which is, I guess, not a huge surprise. It's still a good thing, but they were not performing at a high level, similar high level, as if when they were performing when they used generative AI. So this is a good news, but also not particularly novel. Then you may ask, why did you not start from ground zero with the use of the scaffolding tool and developing human abilities? And that's really a good question. Then we did not observe any additive effect of the combination of the AI support tool and the scaffold itself. Learners remain on the same level that was similar to that when they were using just the AI support tool. So at least in this period of time, in this specific study, we could only observe these two quadrants, either AI-enhanced tools, meaning the illusion of their abilities or ability to perform on the task without really having abilities to do that, or we saw the improvement of the human abilities. Then really the big question, and I don't have the answers, I have some ideas about that, and I have a completely different talk about that topic as well, is how do we develop high human and AI-empowered skills? I think we need to rethink our learning designs and rethink also our assessment approaches if we want to get in that stage. Then the question, the last final question I want to address is how and what effect does generative AI have on information problem solving? Inside of Flora, I mentioned before as well, we also have lots of these writing supports, and we can also support lots of different types of chatbots that are based on large language models. It's easy to plug them in, and good thing is that we can also use our learning analytics facilities to understand what is going on. So I want to specifically now go back to this outer study as well and go to the other two conditions. When students were asked to use ChatGPT versus when they had the option to ask questions a human, actual human teacher, who is an expert in academic writing, who was experienced scientist as well, and a really well-known editor who edited more than 100 papers published in Nature and Science. So in other words, knows how academic writing is done. So unsurprisingly, probably, because we use the same scoring rubric for the students who were not using ChatGPT and those who were using ChatGPT, when they were using ChatGPT, they performed much higher. Because you may argue the task was relatively simple as well to perform as highly. But what we observed is also when we dug deeper into our trace data is that there was almost no evidence of the students using ChatGPT of their metacognitive monitoring. Their self-seeping process, as theorized, was completely broken. They would just get the information, slap it into their essay, and move on, without really spending any moment to evaluate that information and trying to see how it is suitable or not. So we were only able then to see in this particular case what I call is high AI-empowered skills, but very limited human abilities. When learners were chatting with a human, there was nearly perfectly theorized model of help seeking that we identify. In other words, in every situation, students, when they got the information from the human tutor, they would evaluate it before they applied and before they actually wrote something inside of their essays. So what we saw is basically that they were growing their human abilities as part of the process. So then, really, the big question for all of us is, if we then see the learners always using generative AI, is what is the long-term implication of limited monitoring? I said it many times since the hype started about generative AI, is that writing is a really important learning tool. What happens when we deprive the learners from that really big important tool? What happens when learners are continuously not engaging into the metacognitive monitoring is a really big challenge that we need to work on. As you can see here, is basically the problem is that learners are going to basically engage into the cognitive offloading, which is also coupled with the metacognitive offloading, not judgments at all. And they will pretty much be stuck in the low-level skills, and their abilities might even over time deteriorate. So that's basically a potential challenge that we need to tackle with. This is a study I previously mentioned as well from that University of Pennsylvania led with the students in the math education, and they basically found that the use of ChatGPT, vanilla, just to get the answers, right, had a negative effect on their learning as compared to the learners who did not use this tool, or as compared to the learners who also had a GPT-based tutor. So it's two different things. And then a recent study also published earlier this week as well, led by colleagues at TU Munich, where they found that large language models can help us to reduce cognitive load, which makes sense. All this what we spoke about is reducing basically need for us to engage into the information processing. But when they were supposed to demonstrate their argumentative reasoning abilities, they were worse in comparison to the condition when they were asked to perform the same task with the use of Google. That's basically required our metacognitive judgments. So, I presented you very few pieces of information that are happy in this space, right? And we need to have some level of direction as well, where we want to go and how we need to tackle. So, what I basically demonstrated, number one, is this risk that if we continue developing the same type of tutoring system that are not also trying to promote metacognitive abilities of the learners, that learners may not indeed be able to perform in certain types of tasks that require their own personal growth. But we also see really lots of promise that AI-powered scaffolds can also help the learners to engage more into the cognitive and metacognitive processes. This other side is, however, less understood. The challenge is basically that this side, the other side, really requires two different quadrants. One lower quadrant here is what I call is the quadrant of high AI-powered skills, is also the quadrant of the illusion of the performance. Or is this quadrant of the future skills that will be cheap jobs or low-paying jobs for people likely, or jobs that will be always at super high risk of full automation. In other words, when the AI can do it, then you basically don't have much there. If you don't have to use any of your judgments, then what's the point of you to do certain things? The challenge, though, is our essay in higher education is a threat, because it needs to be changed, how we are doing this essay and how we are performing many other tasks in other disciplines, like, for example, computer programming as well as a potential risk. Then the big challenge for us is then how we are minimizing these type of things. My argument there, and I have a whole talk about that, is that we want to basically have the learners to be assessed also on their metacognitive judgments as well as the processes, not on the products only. The other quadrant is basically where we have this quadrant is that combination of high human skills and high also AI-empowered skills. You want experts in certain situations to offload some information so they can actually get even deeper into the problem they are working on. That could be our radiologist. That could be also even our knowledge worker in the factory that is trying to identify the problems with the certain cars that are monitoring on their factory line. And these tasks are really hard to be automated. In that case, they have to engage lots into the cognitive unloading and metacognitive unloading. So then, my proposition is that only can happen when learners have high level of expertise. And so this is the reason why I said there is no free lunch for adaptive learners. The only way to move the learners from high empowered skills is to also first make sure that they develop human skills, our own abilities, before we can actually get into this corner. So there's no like a quick detour or a quick shortcut that we can get as part of the process. This is my basic, completely fake data that I use for this slide, but the proposition here is that learners are engaging much more into the metacognitive activities at the start of their skill development. As they start developing that skill, they don't need to be mindful of every single thing that they are doing, and they will be actually in need to use some of these AI supports less, as well as their own metacognition. However, when we want to push them into the combination with AI, even our radiologists need to get used to this new environment, needs to understand how they're combining their own skills with the use of AI. And that initial step, again, will require deeper engagement into the metacognitive judgments before they also can then develop their own abilities to seamlessly work in combination with AI. All right, I spoke a fair bit. I see John is very keen to start taking questions. So just a couple of final remarks. I hope I made an argument that AI can help us enhance self-regulated skills, but it can equally inhibit them if it's used carelessly. Number two is that effective AI-empowered skills require also high human skills. Otherwise, we are just in the illusion space. And the final thing, I'm hoping we can also work more on the combination of the human and AI to learn together from each other. It's probably like a long-distance future, but a future in which not only we want our AI to learn from us, but we also want to learn from each other as part of the process. And on that very happy note, I want to close my talk, and thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dragan. Yeah, really, wow, what a wonderful presentation. Lots of provocation, lots of questions. Who wants to be brave and take on Dragan with a question addressing something like metacognitive laziness? Is anybody out there wanting to take that one on?
Do we have mics?
Do we have a microphone? Well, look, Tanya's going to get brave. I've got lots of questions. Good.
Hi, Dragan. Thank you for this insightful talk. I agree with most of what you said. Self-regulation is crucial, definitely. No doubt about that. I also agree with what you said about Gen AI. I think the effects are exactly what you did. However, on some of the slides, you used AI support. I assume you wanted to say Gen AI support.
Yeah.
So as you know, I come from the good old-fashioned AI. And in my work, we have seen a lot of transfer when you have AI-based, good old-fashioned AI-based support for self-regulation on the human skills after this support is removed. And that happened in intelligent tutoring systems, but also in the current project we are doing where we use nudges, AI-based support nudges. We see that when we remove nudges, students are still able to write high-quality comments. It's a writing task, but shorter pieces of text. So I just wanted to point out that you know, sure, maybe some people in the audience are not aware that there is other type of AI. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Tanya. So here's the key thing. When I say AI support tool, I mean these. Just aims to improve performance, good fit for the task, and requires AI tool. It's not the scaffold tool. What you are developing, I call these the scaffolding tools. And so you're on this other dimension, in my view. So I'm talking about the AI assistant that makes us lazy versus your AI assistants that make us work hard and think hard. So thanks for the comment. There's here in the...
Hi, Dragan. Good morning. In today's youth, I personally observed that they would retrieve information instantaneously because of the short-form videos. And what would be your piece of advice, especially to teachers, on how to persuade their respective learners that maybe doing something that is far more difficult would be a more helpful way towards their learning? Because you've said earlier that learners are not good judgments, or they're not good arbiters of their own personalized learning. So in this day and age, how can we bypass that paradoxical and counterintuitive idea that the more difficult the learning strategy could be, the better your learning capability is?
I think it requires redesign of our tasks, requires also redesign of what we do in education, how we do the assessment. Requires far more systemic changes. My view is that we need to shift in many situations from the assessment that are now just focused exclusively on the product to the assessments that are basically taking information about the process as well as specific judgments that students are taking. So in other words, our assessments itself, because they are driving what students are going to do. If you basically have your assessment tasks, they are not representing the values that we want to promote. Therefore, our assessments need to change with the time as well. That is basically changing.
Thank you, Jochen. One question is, MIT Review recently add some comments. They do some research about adding fractions into the response. Now, the generative AI, people generally just accept it. This is very common, as you mentioned. But they do some experiment and try to add fraction. That means they want to add purposely that some response, not just generated from generative AI, but at subtraction in between. That means purposely it is incorrect, to alert people not directly accept anything generated from the computer. But do you think that kind of consideration is possible to enhance this AI-human collaboration?
Great question. My challenge, so for experts, yes, and those who are sensitive to some of that information. For those who are just learning, it will be difficult. Part of the reason is that it's not just the information itself, but the way how that information is presented. And that information, usually when generative AI is presenting, is nicely packaged, reads really well. And we have this illusion of truth. And so that's the challenge, right, that we are grappling with, is that we basically, generative AI nailed the stylistic structures while completely ignoring the truth. And so then how we are going to tackle that problem, I don't know. But I'm not necessarily optimistic that just the simple ingestion or inducing some of these factual information will solve fully the problem. I think we need to get the learners into different types of learning designs that are promoting something what Madhu Kapoor calls productive failure. I have a sample of one, my own daughter, who is the biggest skeptic of ChatGPT. We asked her to use something for homework intentionally to show her that ChatGPT cannot do something. Now, 8-year-old, whenever I ask her, Tara, maybe we can chat that with ChatGPT, said, no, it's stupid, doesn't know anything, doesn't want to do it. So he's completely skeptical of that particular technology, which is also maybe not necessarily completely healthy because it can be useful in certain other types of tasks.
Dragan, I'm aware that...
Can I ask another question?
Yes, one quick question, please. We've got 1 minute.
Okay, God, it's so hard. This is a quick question. Hey, Dragan, this is Shan from University of Florida. This is great work, very impressive. I think I have a very quick question. The first question about the scaffolding. I wonder if you, what's your thought on when to intervene students when we identify they are confused? And when to provide the scaffolding, what is the best timing? For example, 2015, Cindy DiMello's paper shows confusion could be beneficial for students learning, right? And then I was wondering, we're curious about provide scaffolding in this computer and system learning environment, through the system. Then have you figured out when to best intervene students and how to identify the moment they are actually thinking for help, not just gaming the system? That is my first question. My second question is about, we already understand generative AI could beneficial for students learning in a short-term run. Like they may have a strong self-efficacy after they see the learning gains using generative AI, but for the long-term run, it's actually hurtful for their learning. I wonder, and we already like developed different ChatGPT and a filtered version of ChatGPT that prevent student, like telling students direct answers. But I'm wondering about the next step. Have you figured out what type of effective pedagogies or hints like we can provide to students to engage into the filtered ChatGPT, if that makes sense?
Sure, no, good question. So, look, I don't think there is one answer to your question. On that kind of first question, when to intervene. Tanya probably can give you a whole tutorial on when to intervene because it's so task the specific and the context is specific as well. In certain situations, yes, if you are looking at from a kind of confusion, etc., intervene, but how you are gauging that it's a challenge. Also, there are different things that came up recently. People are really terrible at problem solving and finding good solutions when they are initially using ChatGPT. So in other words, better to ask people to use initially their own human brainstorming ideas before engaging with generative AI. So there are certain other types of things. But I would say that it's so contextual in education, and every type of task and types of skills requires careful consideration. What works in computing may not work in writing and so on. And so just focusing on one specific dimension, confusion or not, may not be sufficient because learners are making lots of different contextual judgments. And therefore, I'm spending the last 15 years trying to get the right type of data that you can actually understand what state learners are before you can actually make something meaningful. So I know I didn't give you the right answer, but that's all what I can offer at this stage.
Okay, I think you'll have some more time. I hope you've got some more time over the next few days. I know there's lots more questions. I've got several, but I'm under instructions to be mindful about the time here. So with that, I'd just like everybody to join me in thanking Dragan once again. And Dragan, we have a certificate for you. And a photo op. I don't know who's going to take the photo. Someone going to take the photo?